Welcome to the LBS webinar series Beyond the Crisis. I'm Julian Birkinshaw, Professor at the Business School, and I'm your host for this entire series, which is now in its 13th week. So this is webinar number 25, in case you're keeping count. Today, we're going to be talking about how to build collaboration and innovation over the coming months. And to discuss this important issue, first of all, we have my colleague, Professor Linda Gratton, who's a Professor of Management Practice in the Organizational Behavior area. Welcome, Linda.
Hi, welcome, Julian.
Thanks very much for joining us. Also, we have Jenny Emery, who is the Global People and Culture Leader at Arup, the engineering consultancy. Well, welcome, Jenny.
Hi, thank you.
Thanks. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Linda, who's going to talk to us a little bit about collaboration and innovation. Linda.
Thank you, Julian, and welcome to everybody. Actually, I did the first webinar of the pandemic. Julian and I were actually at London Business School at the time. And what I focused on there was what I believed to be the most important issue right then, which is how do we even think about virtual working? Well, we're now on day 86. So those of you who know me know I've been keeping a diary. This is actually volume 3 of my pandemic diary. And it seems to me that the issues that we face now aren't so much about working virtually, but we're also now moving towards issues of productivity. We're moving into the next stage of a recession. We need to really be sure that everything that we're using, all the resources that we're using, are really going to really work for us. And also, I think specifically the issue of collaboration. That's what I'd like to talk about today. And I'm absolutely thrilled that Jenny from Arup is here to join me, because I'm talking theoretically, but of course she's not just thinking about it for her own employees, but Arup is also advising companies all around the world. My particular issue really is about collaboration, specifically about innovation. Now let me share my screen so that you can take a look at really what I'm thinking about when it comes to that. Now, you know, if we sort of step back and say, well, what's the theory of collaboration? As some of you know, I wrote a book called Hotspots many years ago about that very point. And what I said there was really, you know, for a collaborative place to work where people are collaborating, innovating, sharing ideas with each other, we need to do 4 things. And they're slightly different issues in many ways. The first is really about culture. And that means, you know, that's the way that senior executives are behaving. That's to do with the practices and processes you've got. And so really you need a sort of bedrock that says, in general, people trust each other, and in general, they're cooperative. Now, that really sets the scene, but what really moves knowledge around the organization and indeed into your stakeholder groups, be that your consumers or indeed be that your broader shareholders, is networks. And by networks, I mean how knowledge is being moved across, either because people know each other very well, or they don't know each other, they're more associates. And there are issues of how much are my networks similar to me, how are they different, what are the boundaries? The third is what I call productive capacity, and that's really around, you know, when you're in a team, do you know how to behave collaboratively? Do you, for example, know how to work through challenges of conflict? Do you know how to understand each other? Do you have the practices to build empathy? And that in a sense sets the scene, but what ignites cooperation is really a sense of purpose or an ignition, which could be a question. You know, I know a lot of you at the moment are feeling very energized because people are saying, you know, what's going to be the new norm? What are we moving towards? They could be a huge challenge. I mean, many of the companies that I'm advising and writing about at the moment have had to move you know, up to 60, 70% of their employees into the home in a very short period of time. The combination of these 4 areas are really what creates cooperation in your organization. In other words, you need to do all 4 of them. Well, let's start with a poll. And which of these 4 elements are you most concerned about right now? So which of the ones are you thinking, is it to do with the cooperative culture? Maybe you feel that trust is beginning to ebb as people don't see each other so well. Is it the structure of networks? We know, for example, that when people are working virtually at home, their networks start to collapse. They spend more time with people who are like themselves, who they know. Is it productive capacity? Are you, for example, finding it hard to do things like conflict resolution, to understand the politics often of cooperation? Or is it an igniting purpose? Do you feel that actually it's hard right now to build a sense of purpose, a sense of narrative that's really going to ignite these cooperative practices and processes? So let's take a look at which one you feel you're most concerned about right now. So fill in that poll, and then we'll take a look at your responses. There you go. So in fact, and again, that's sort of, rather interesting in a sense that for each of you, you have your unique issue. But by the way, just as an aside, those of you who know my work know that I talk about something called signatures, where I say you have to build your own way of doing things. This is particularly important, by the way, at this moment. It's very difficult to copy other people. And what that's showing is that across the many hundreds of people who are on this webinar right now, you have your unique challenge. Some of you are worried about cooperative culture. Some of you are worried about networks. Some of you about the productive capacity. Do we know how to deal with conflict? And some, the actual igniting purpose. So let's take a look at that in a bit more detail. Well, we know that right now the data is that people are struggling with cooperation, and for a number of reasons, really. One is just the sheer volume. Day 86 of our pandemic adventure. And we're feeling, Julie and I were just talking earlier, nobody's taking any holidays, where energy is beginning to flag. Those batteries that are so important to us are starting to move out of energy. Some people are feeling that, at work, they're not really have a sense of belonging. Julian, I don't know if you remember, but in that very first webinar, I asked people, what's your experience right now? Thinking that perhaps a number of people would say, oh, I'm worried about technology. Actually, that was only 5%. And in fact, I did the same poll just last week with another group. The number one thing that you said was, I don't feel as if I've got a sense of belonging. I don't feel that, I'm missing my friends. I'm missing being around people. And also, and I think this is becoming more of an issue, it's hard for us to know where to go to for information. I mean, when you think about the normal working practices, even if you're working virtually, there's times when you get into an office, chatting to people after a meeting, sharing insights that you might not want to share on an email, but you do want to share. So there are some pretty important issues emerging right now. So let's take a look at a way of thinking about that. Sorry, I moved 2 points. I want to first of all talk about networks, because my worry is that what's happening with home working and with virtual working is that it's doing some things very well, but it's not doing other things so well. So what we know is that we are beginning to constrain our networks because we are reaching out to people that we know well. I mean, if you think about who have you chatted to in the last month, my guess is that lots of those people you've chatted to are people you already know, or people you know sort of pretty well. We know that also networks are weakening. I mean, all of the associates that you have, those weak ties that you have into your network, are beginning to weaken. And what we're also observing is this formation of in-groups and out-groups. And that's actually been exacerbated, I think, by the furlough process, where I just read some chat from a webinar I did a few days ago, and people said, we really feel that the people who are working full-time are incredibly busy. They're just absolutely going for it. But those on furlough are becoming more and more of an out group because they're not being part of what this organization is. But even without furlough, there's also a real issue that you're focusing on the people you know very well, and not so much on others. So let's take a look at that with regard to network theory. So those of you who have been to London Business School or been to any of my programs will know a little bit about this. Let me, sorry, I'm fiddling around with my screen here. So think about it in this way. You know, in terms of the network that you've got and the network that's been created in your organization right now, you can think about it with strong and weak ties. A strong tie is where you have a relationship with somebody which is pretty strong. You know them well. You could ask them about their kids. You know where they, perhaps you know where they live. If you sent them an email, you'd expect them to respond. These tend to be trusting networks. They're networks where information flows very easily. And they're very good at exploiting knowledge. Now, these networks have been crucial for you in the last 86 days, because actually what you've had to do was to work under enormous pressure to move forward. And actually having people around who know each other well, who trust each other well, who know what the issues are, that's been incredibly important in terms of exploiting the knowledge that you already have. But let's take a look at another form of network. And this time, sorry, I've moved ahead again. This time I want to look not just at this sort of a network, but also one where you're moving across boundaries. Now, these turn out to be very important. So my guess is right now, you're also reaching out to people in different parts of the business who you know pretty well to ask if you can synthesize information, by which I mean you're adding what they know in their network and world to what you know in your network and world. And that combination is bringing new value to you. So that we call that exploration through synthesis. You're synthesizing information from one part of your business to another. I know in the companies that I've been involved in, that's been very useful, because sometimes another part of the business knows how to crack the problem that you're solving. And it's that combination that can be incredibly helpful. But the piece that I'm sort of worried about is this third, which is not just strong ties, but rather weak ties. Now, weak ties are the many hundreds of people you know. They're the associates that you know, they're colleagues that you've perhaps met a year ago, that you're sort of bumping into each other. And my worry is that right now it's those networks that are disappearing, because it's those novel combinations of people where you just happen to stumble across a new idea with somebody that you only have just met or you don't know very well. It's what we could call the water cooler conversations, where you just bump into somebody. Now, of course, an office has many reasons for being there, and Jenny's going to talk about that in a moment. But of course, one of the things an office does is it provides you with a space that you can bump into each other. And my worry is that actually we're not doing that. So I've written a piece in the FT last week. I have a Sloan management review coming out this morning, actually, really on that process, to say, well, you know, maybe we should be worried about this. Now, let me give you a way of thinking about that, because, you know, as you think about the future and think about collaboration and think about productivity, remember that not all jobs are the same. And I think that right now, in terms of our conversation about the new normal, or what it is we're moving towards, we have to be very thoughtful, both about what people want in terms of their own character, but also about the jobs that they're doing. And let me give you three personas, as it were, to help you think about that. The first is a call center operator. Now, I choose a call center operator because the only experimental piece of work on home working was done by Nick Bloom of Stanford at a Chinese call center. And Nick has suddenly become quite a celebrity because of that little known study, which is now the only study. What he found, by the way, is that people who worked from home, so it was an experiment. Let me start from the beginning. It was an experiment. Half the people worked from home, half of them worked in the office. He looked at productivity, he looked at retention rates, and he looked at you know, how people felt over a period of time. What he found is that productivity of people working from home went up by about 13%, which is quite a lot right now. And you then have to say, well, what is it about the call center job that allowed people to work from home with ease? Well, the first is that the call center job is pretty autonomous. You don't need to be talking to other call center people. You're basically talking on the telephone to a client or a customer. And the reason that worked really well is productivity went up because people had fewer distractions. They took more calls. Now, why did they take more calls? Well, one of the things that Nick said at the beginning of the experiment was the people who worked from home, A, had to have a home office fully equipped with the technology, and B, had to not be distracted by children. I'll say no more about that because I think you know where I'm going on this. By the way, at the end of that, 50% of people who had moved into their homes decided to come back. And they came back for exactly the same reason that we spoke of earlier, which is they became lonely. They weren't socializing with their colleagues. So look, the point is home working is brilliant for people doing that sort of work, which is autonomous, relatively straightforward. But then we get to the next type of work, and I'm going to call that an accountant for the. Now here again, home working works pretty well for accountants. So we know quite a lot of freelance accountants actually are based at home. That works well, again, because they do longer hours, because they have fewer distractions. Remember, the office can be a very distracting place. They've got autonomous tasks, and it increases their flexibility. So you tend to have high levels of job satisfaction because people can chunk their time. They can say, I'm working now, and then I'm stopping working. However, they're not socializing. And also, I sort of worry about whether they're going to create those links that allow them to exploit knowledge with their colleagues. But here's the real issue. I've called this person a research scientist, but you could think about that as any high-grade knowledge worker. Again, working from home is great, few distractions, more autonomy. However, here we get those bumping in. In the FT article, I talked to a friend of mine who runs the Crick, Paul Nurse, who runs the Crick Institute in the UK, which has brought together a lot of the cancer research scientists in the UK into one building. It's just down the road at Euston. Why did he do that? Well, because he wanted them to bump into each other, to talk about what they'd found. And this is really what's missing. So let me ask you the second poll. What describes your current experience? Are you finding that small working teams are highly productive? Are you struggling to get functions or businesses to work together, i.e. that boundary spanning? What about the serendipity of novel combinations? Are you worried, as I am, about possible downturn in innovation and creativity? Or is it something different, in which case, please put your views into the chat and we'll hear more about it. So let's take a look at this poll. I've then got a couple more things to say and I'll hand over to Jenny. So here we have it. Yeah, okay. Small groups have been pretty productive. In fact, actually at the beginning, people said they felt productivity had gone down. But the issue is about novel combinations. And that's sort of where I see it as well, that this is an issue. Let me then talk about a couple of things that you might want to think about. Number one, actions to take. Number one, boundary spanners are really important to you, particularly during this period. These are people who understand, who have networks through to other parts of the business. Make sure you encourage them to keep on those boundary spanning activities. Number two, widen the network of involvement. How do you do that? Well, you know, for example, platforms that allow thousands of people to talk together. We ran an amazing one last week where we got 30,000 people from a telecoms to talk to each other. That's not exactly the water cooler conversation, but it's sort of a bit like it. And thirdly, make sure that when we go back to the office, in whatever form we do, we actually use that time, that precious time, as much as we possibly can. I also think there's much we can do in terms of driving purpose. Here are three ideas here, which I think could really push collaboration in your organization. Number one, tell a story. I've said for some time, I've written a piece in Sloan about this, about the role of the leader now as telling a story of the future. Nobody knows what the future is going to be, but we need to build scenarios and stories about that. Make sure you share the vision. And thirdly, use your leaders as role models, both to role model trust, but also to ignite people's experience. Let me finish by saying, for me, this is an ongoing conversation. Please fill in my COVID-19 survey. Take a look at the MIT Sloan article, which was published today. And also, happy to share with you an overview of this webinar. Just drop me an email, link into me, or think about Twitter. Over to Jenny.
Thank you so much, Linda. Lots and lots for us to think about there. I will introduce myself and tell you a little bit about Arup by way of context. So just let me share my screen now. So I am the Global People and Culture Leader at Arup. For those of you who don't know us, we are a global design, architect and engineering consultancy. We work in 74 offices worldwide. There are 16,500 of us, and we are member owned, which I think is an important fact to bear in mind when I come to talk about some aspects of our culture a little bit later on. And we span a whole spectrum of work, from deep technical design work right through to strategic advisory work. And I thought I could usefully perhaps bring just two quite different lenses to the conversation today. One is the one that I imagine all of us on this call are bringing in some guise or another, which is, the question of, what are the opportunities and the challenges associated with having 16,500 creative professionals who are used to all being together, working from home. And in particular, in that context, I thought I could build a little bit on our experience of the network piece and the purpose piece that Linda pulled out in particular in her presentation. But the different lens that we can also bring at Arup, given that we are experts in the built environment, is what are the implications of all of this for how space works, physical spaces, virtual spaces, including offices. What are they for now, and how do we use them? So I was proposing to take a reasonably quick and eclectic route through all of that, beginning in London in 1946, then going through an amazing new fact I've just learned about bumblebees, sharing an old adage, sharing an old man's ears, talking about thermal imaging, cork floors and sustainability. So let's see how we can stitch all of that together. This is a photograph of the London Library in St James's Square in London in 1946. I love this photograph because if, like me, you love books, then the whole notion that people would pick through the rubble in their overcoats and hats and then casually browse books on a shelf, I think is just delightful. But I love it also because it epitomizes this particular period in history when London and much of the rest of the world was in the aftermath of something. So this is a period in which the future was very unclear. And the resonances for us today are really striking. There were rays of hope. So for example, on the 7th of June, 1946, just 2 days ago, in 1946, the BBC resumed television broadcasting for the first time since the end of the war. Can you imagine how exciting that must have been? But in a couple of weeks' time, on the 27th of June in 1946, the UK government had to impose bread rationing because there just wasn't enough bread and grain to go around. So good things and bad things and difficult decisions. Into this backdrop walks Ove Arup, who grew up in the north of England, the son of immigrants, Danish mother, Norwegian father. And he is 51 years old at this point, which I like. This is not a young person's founder story, right? He's had a bit of action. And he had a vision for total architecture, which is the foundation of what Arup is about. And he said, I believe that if we bring together the best artists and the best designers and the best engineers, we can recreate the built environment in a completely different way. And that is kind of where Arup came from. So you can imagine our roots are collaboration for innovation in a time of great difficulty and amidst great uncertainty. And so for all that, just like all of us, we are humbled, unsure, daunted about what's ahead of us, we're also excited and a little bit curious about what looks set to be the biggest change in the built environment in our lifetime. So how are we thinking about all of that? We talk a lot about creativity at Arup, you can imagine. And sometimes you get the sense that this is something a bit whimsical and ethereal, and we all need, to take naps and not get too busy and, trade a little bit of efficiency in order to allow this creativity to flourish. And there's definitely some truth in that. But here is the cool new fact that I learned about bumblebees. This is a newly published research paper from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, who found that when pollen is scarce, bees can extort more from plants. And they do that by biting into the leaves with their mandibles and proboscises to induce flowering up to 1 month earlier than it would otherwise happen. I've been thinking about that a lot and wondering how that applies to business, if that applies to business. And that leads me to that old adage, which is it true that necessity is the mother of invention? That perhaps when we have our feet most to the fire and we're most under pressure, that we can be creative. And we've certainly seen some immediate pandemic examples of that in our work at Arup. So just to give you two to bring that to life a bit, we've developed in collaboration with a number of NGOs a product called CareBox, which is essentially a way that it's a modular system so that critical care capability in hospitals in the UK, in the US, and in developing countries, crucially, can be expanded really quickly. Another example would be a product called Neuron, which you can see on the screen. And this is an AI-powered building management system, building management platform, which we're now using to operate a thermal imaging system for lots of clients in China who are able to take the temperature of people as they move around. So those are just a couple of examples of where innovation in collaboration can happen, even under the present circumstances. But just bringing that back to our business then, and how we're thinking about purpose. Let's talk about networks first. By a complete piece of dumb luck, 2 weeks before lockdown happened, we conducted a huge conversation across all our members. I mentioned that we're member owned, which means that we ask our members about things a lot. So we had a big conversation under this hashtag all ears. We showed different ears for weeks in the run up to the event. And this was in collaboration with Linda's consultancy Hotspots. And this is of Arup's ear, which we used on the last day. And we had this notion around it, that true vision comes from listening. So going into the pandemic, we had really good insights from our members about what was important to them around us being very transparent, very purposeful, very innovative. They wanted more collaboration, not less. And we have used all the findings from that really explicitly as a lever to help keep people close during this period. And we've been supporting our leaders in particular, really helping leaders to run listening sessions, giving them coaching, having them engaged in webinars to upskill them so that they can be very visible and really share their experience and encourage people to make sense and make connections with each other. And the result of all of that, slightly counterintuitively, has been that I feel now that I'm working in a much more intimate organization than I did previously. And it's almost like we've gone from having 74 offices, maybe operating slightly in silos, to 16,500 people who could work in 16,500 silos or just in one big hive. And we feel that people are much more readily engaging with people all across the business, so that networking that Linda described is happening by virtue of us all being in the same position. And that's really exciting. The other thing that we've done is to really, really double down on our purpose. Arup is a purpose-led organization, always has been. And we took a decision just last week, amidst all of this, to publish our new strategy, which we had planned to publish, which re-articulated our purpose, which is all about shaping a better world, to say that what shaping a better world means for us now is that sustainability is absolutely at the heart of our business. And we felt it was so important, even amidst all the uncertainty, to be able to be crystal clear about that and to use that as a guiding star for everyone in all of the work that we're doing. And we've had one very immediate example, not actually directly in the client workspace, but where that courage of being explicit about that last week has already paid off, which is in the context of the Black Lives Matters movement that has really come to the fore again, and rightly so, this past week. Because we have been able to engage in that conversation on the basis of this purpose and being explicit that because we're committed to sustainability, we're committed to peace and justice and strong institutions and equality, and that we care about how power and privilege and all of those things are used in society. And that whole conversation has been made much easier and much more engaging for everyone because we put our purpose front and center. So that's how we're thinking about it for us as Arup. Just a few thoughts then in closing about this question of space. What are physical spaces in service of at this point? I was moaning to a friend. I've got 4 children and a husband and a dog all at home, and I was moaning about the mess in my house. And my friend said that it reminded her of her grandmother's farmhouse growing up in rural New Zealand, where everything happens in the same place. It's your place of work, it's your place of home, it's everything. So our relationship with home is changing. Arup does lots and lots of work in the transport space. So our relation, what on earth do we do with airports and train stations and how people move? There's so much to think about there. What are cities for? What are our public squares and spaces? How do we use those? So many questions. But we've also been asking ourselves, what are offices for? This is one of our offices. This is Melbourne. It's my favourite, I think, of the offices in the Arup network. And you can see just from this photograph that it has been designed for collaboration, right? So the line of sight through the building means that lots of people can see each other. There are excuses to pass each other's desks. There are places where you can just sit and congregate for an informal conversation. And it's all cork flooring so that there's none of that clattering. It feels like home. It feels like somewhere that you can just be and chat and have conversations. We believe that we need spaces like this in the future as much as we do now. We need them for encounters with each other, with the quality of space, with knowledge. We need them massively in order for people to learn so much, and I'm sure this is true of anybody here who's in a professional services organisation. So much is by osmosis, by listening, by being alongside people, and we still need that. So we need to be really intentional and considered about how we design physical space and how we use it. But we also need to be really considered about how we use virtual space. There are things that work better virtually. We've been running increasingly for our clients and big public consultation projects virtually. It's much easier to imagine what a bridge will look like if you can, be in that space through virtual reality and see what all the options might look like. You get far more people engaging in the discussion that way. And we've also been running design workshops virtually. As a matter of necessity in the current times, and had lots and lots of our people reporting that those are the best design workshops they've ever participated in, because it's so democratic and so exploratory and so much easier than having people confined in a room. So the biggest Arup takeaway for me currently is this thing about just being very, very intentional about how we design and convene and use both physical and virtual space to help support collaboration.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Linda. As always, there's a whole bunch of questions. We've got a good 35 questions as well as a huge amount in chat. So I'm going to ask you a few, and then perhaps towards the end, if you want to browse things as well, feel free to pick up questions I haven't asked. So a lot of people are picking up on this fact that, of course, the grapevine, the sort of the water cooler type activities are less available in a virtual world. So the very specific question, I guess, to Linda first is, what is the best examples you've actually seen of digital water coolers? I mean, you touched on this telecom company. I mean, I'm not sure if that was a success or not, but if there have been some good experiments in doing this, you've probably seen them. What's the best example you've seen?
Well, I think, Julian, I think, by the way, first of all, let me say to Jenny, thank you so much, Jenny, for a fantastic conversation. And I want to come back to this question of intentionality and considered, because I think that's actually the issue right now. Even 5 years ago, we really didn't have any capacity at all to bring people together on large platforms. We now do. Arup, as you saw, has done that. Others have done it as well. So I think one of the ways of creating a water cooler is to use the technology to do that. You've got platforms. Zoom isn't a great one because it's too small to see everybody, but there are other platforms that allow you to do that. So I think we should really let technology be our friend. I think we should be as experimental as possible. In all of the webinars I've spoken of recently, really reinforced two things that Jenny said about the future. One is it's co-creational. There's no way that somebody at the top of an organization will know what to do in the future. This is too big an issue. We need to build consensus and we need to build a co-creational process. And the second is, as you've said yourself, Julian, it's about experimenting. So I would encourage you to experiment as much as you possibly can right now to really find out, what's going on. Just as an aside in the chat, I see a number of you said, what's the link to my survey? Just drop me an email and we have a whole thing we can send you, which has got the link and everything. So lgratton@london.edu will do that. So yes, I think we can use technology to build those water coolers. But when we get back to the office, as we will, I'm doing a piece for the BBC, which will probably be out on Thursday, where we have a big discussion about what's going to happen to the office. I don't think everybody will want to work from home. I think for particular groups, it's not at all what they want. I think many of us will want to work from home on occasions, maybe 3 days a week, but I don't think we're going to want to work from home. And then, as Jenny says, the real issue is, what is an office for? We've really been using it almost as a factory. It's become it's almost the last vestiges of the Industrial Revolution. Let's forget about it being a factory. And as Jenny says, make it more as a community or as a home where you actually don't do work that could be done at home. I think should be done at home, but then the office is a place which is a place of collaboration.
Good. Jenny, what's your, you touched on it already, but the real problem is the serendipitous connections that Linda already touched on, right? Which is, it's so hard to imagine a virtual version of that. I literally cannot imagine what that looks like. Almost like speed dating through Zoom, where you spend 30, 60 seconds with each person to see if you make a connection, a business connection. Jenny, have you seen any experiments in Arup that might help us down that track?
Yes, we have just been trying different things. I guess there's a spectrum. In designing big events where we're bringing lots of people together and we explicitly want something innovative to emerge from that, we've been quite considered about how we just convene sort of breakout groups, what questions we ask and so on, and encouraging people to kind of forced serendipity, if that's not a contradiction in terms. Others kind of at team level, we've just been aware of, and asking people to share and just keep mixing it up. So some people just daily dropping in on their teams in Microsoft Teams to just have a chat and engage and share some thoughts and make connections and suggest that they speak to somebody else, and using the people in the business who we know are good at that in real life and helping them to do that in virtual life. But then also increasingly, the number of people who report that the best part of their day is just picking up the phone, not Zoom, not screen, to someone like they would have in the old days. So you still get the chance to have a conversation with someone who goes, oh, have you spoken to Fred about that? Because he had, we did something together 7 years ago, and just calling Fred, not in the diary, is, so we're just trying to get people to do some of that, good old fashioned pick up the phone as well, because I think people's days have felt quite scheduled. It's less the remoteness and more the relentlessness of the scheduling. I think that's the enemy of that kind of creativity.
I agree with Jenny, and I think that what we've lost is that serendipity, isn't it? The just endless Zooms. And I want to reinforce Jenny's point about boundary spanners, which is a point I made earlier, which is to say there already are people in your organizations who are good at reaching into other parts of the business. use those people, because those are the people who are already connecting, making those connections, and then experiment as much as you can with as many technology platforms as you can. I mean, I happen to work with Arapont using ours, but there are others available, which really allow thousands of people to talk to each other in a moderated environment. I mean, that technology is already available. So I think coming back to Jenny's point of intentionality and considered, for me, sits at the very heart of this. It has to be intentional and it has to be considered. A number of you are saying, are there any other webinars? I've done a whole series of webinars about the pandemic. Again, if you drop me a note, I'll send you a link to all of those.
Someone who's commenting as much as asking a question, but they say remote working is trying to replicate previous face-to-face working practices. And this happens, every time a new technology comes along, rather than generate new ones. And of course, at London Business School, the first thing we did when we were locked down was we took our exact teaching schedule and we dropped it into Zoom. And obviously that works, but it doesn't work as well as coming up with new and better ways of using this technology. So I don't know if either of you want to comment on, of course, speculating on what comes next. There's a risk that we do just get stuck in old ways of doing things, but digitally, rather than getting rid of some of the old practices which didn't work so well.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, Julian. I did a webinar last week about the new future. And one of the questions I said, these are 5 questions that might be on your mind right now. And the number one thing that was on people's minds when we did the poll was what to let go of. And I think that you're absolutely right, Julian, that it would be a terrible shame if we've now all become digital natives. We all know how to use technology, even our CEOs, if we just go back to how we were working. So we have to think of new ways and experiment with new ways of using both digital platforms to support us, but also of really thinking about what is it when people are face-to-face, because we will be face-to-face. We will be face-to-face at some stages. So thinking about what those spaces are going to be, as Jenny said, how do you use that space is going to be absolutely crucial. And also thinking about the tasks of the job. One of the pieces of work I'm doing at the moment is to think about what are the tasks you need to do in your job, and what's the process, the collaborative process with regard to technology or face-to-face that's required. Because there are some tasks which, honestly, sitting on your own, in your home, on your own is absolutely the best way to do it. There are others where you need to make those connections. So I think we need to be much more intentional, to use Jenny's word, about the tasks that we do and how those can best be achieved.
Good. Jenny, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question. I mean, by all means, pick up on that as well. But, you talked about the changes, of course, in the office life. What will the office of the future look like? As Linda says, we will go back to some degree to what happened before. But let's assume for a second that some sort of socially distanced kind of way of working is with us for a few years, which is not inconceivable at all. Now, have you started to think about what the hybrid office of the future looks like? A couple of people have asked that. What does a hybrid office look like where we can still work, but we have to work with greater space? There must be clever people in Arup who are thinking about that exact question right now.
We are, and there's a really interesting tension, and because we haven't got timeframes, it's even harder to articulate, between where I think we want to end up, which is all the stuff we've just talked about learning all the great stuff and using it, and which, when you close your eyes, you imagine this office full of encounters and people meeting and doing the stuff that we can't do remotely, versus this interim period where all the conversations are about the amount of fresh air you have to pump into each meeting room per person in order to be able to have X number of people in the room for Y duration, and if you run a projector that makes it hotter, so you need to and that stuff is almost like a polar opposite in terms of the conversation. It's about what restrictions do we have to put in place for people, and some of that, it's why would you then come to the office if you can't be in a meeting with somebody, if you have to be at a desk? Now, for some of our people, they still do need to, because the quality of their workspace or whatever means that it's better for everybody's mental health and well-being to be in the office. But that longer-term collaborative thing, I think, is a different model. So yeah, we're giving advice to lots and lots of companies now and clients now, which is much more around kind of health and safety and compliance, and when you open a building, on what basis do you open it, and so on, and how can we use tech and digital to help with that. Longer term, that behavioural piece, I think, takes you in a slightly different direction.
I'm just going to share this. I saw a picture on an online newspaper about the classroom of the future, the business school classroom of the future. And there was, 60 people, all with their little plexiglass surroundings. I mean, it was just horrific. I mean, I'm not saying that's a bad idea in the short term, because clearly that's one way of getting people back in the class, and keeping some distance. But as a vision of the future, it's quite scary. Linda, what do you think the collaborative teaching classroom of the future looks like? Or sorry, the hybrid teaching classroom of the future?
Yeah, well, Julian, I agree with you. One of the points that you made was absolutely crucial earlier on, which is to say, when we're faced with the situation we have now, particularly in terms of using technology, the first thing we do is simply use technology to replicate what we already do. And by the way, you were talking about it in education, but that's true for almost every process. So almost all of you, thank you for these amazing comments, by the way. All of you who are out there trying to think about the processes, the first thing you do is to say, how can I make this process? How can I bring technology into it? And that's a mistake. And I think that the challenge we've got now is as Jenny's saying, look, when you think about what do we do next, our first question has to be about health and safety, but it cannot end there. There has to be a bigger question, which is about what's the purpose of education? As you know, Julian, and I've made this very clear with Andrew Scott in our new book, The New Long Life, we would love to see the reinvention of education. We would love education to be about lifelong learning. We would love people of all ages to come in and to London Business School and be educated. We would love to have hybrid, so this is our opportunity to reinvent a sector which, let's face it, Julian, has been rather slow to reinvent itself.
Yeah, that's for sure. And I'm part of the LBS task force that is looking at, what does that hybrid classroom of the future look like? Which actually does bring me to a question a couple of people asked, which links to something, Linda, you said right at the beginning. You talked about the in-crowd, out-crowd effect. I mean, my daughter doesn't suffer from the fear of missing out anymore because she knows her friends can't go out and socialize anyway. But actually the fear of missing out in a business context is very real, because there are those who are around the table making decisions, and all those other people who are kind of worried if they're making the right decisions, feeling that they should be part of those conversations. Any bright ideas, either of you, for how we can stop that, how we can help that process to work better, to avoid people feeling that?
I agree, Julian, and I've talked to quite a number of senior people, and one of their worries is that we've always had in-groups and out-groups in organizations, and then the in-group will sit in a big room, but as they walk out to the corridor and meet other people will stop them and say, oh, by the way, have you thought about, and all of those side conversations are going. So I think we need to build large-scale conversations, a bit like the one that Jenny did at Arup, where you get hundreds or thousands of people talking to each other openly about big issues, about what's our purpose, about how we're going to move back to the office, about how do we want to work. Because it seems to me right now that none of us have got the answers to this. Julian, you and I spend all our time thinking about issues like this. And this webinar is the best I can do in terms of where my own thinking is. So it's not that there's this amazing answer that we just haven't told you yet. The simple truth is these are extraordinary times that require all of us to be experimental, to be intentional, and to use all the technologies available to us to make sure that the next stage beyond the health and well-being problem that we have right now, it actually means that we get back to something better. I've said from the beginning of this pandemic, in terms of the future of work, we have an opportunity to accelerate the trends that we wanted to see, and so it would be such a shame if we didn't use this as an opportunity to reinvent work.
Yeah. Jenny, any more observations on this?
I agree with everything Linda just said. I think this next period is crucial and really hard. Yeah. We talked to our leaders about how difficult it was for them to lead 16,500 people suddenly remote. It's much harder when you've got some people in the office and some out. And also this point about just the diversity of experience and response. So we've got team leaders who are leading a team who 13 weeks ago looked the same, and now are kind of coming back to the office having had profoundly different experiences and feeling profoundly different about the whole thing. And so how we help people, we were saying that in this interim period, learning, as we mentioned earlier, capturing everything we've learned is a huge priority. Dealing with mental health and well-being is a huge priority, but just being really cognizant of that adjustment and understanding that that some degree of normalcy has to reassert itself at some point, but that for everyone that will be quite a different experience. This is like black belt leadership at the moment, it feels to me. It's proper hard.
We've only got about 5 minutes left, and if either of you wants to pick up on something said in the chat before we close, do so. But let me ask one more question first, which is, we haven't talked about this at all, but one of the reasons that face-to-face is good is what we can call ceremonial. In other words, a congregation event, an opportunity to have a little bit of a party. And I don't mean so much the social parts of that, but actually literally the ceremony and the feeling that it matters because there are 200 people in the room. We haven't got any means that I've come across of replicating ceremonial activities online, somehow a Zoom call, where you line up to get your degree or whatever. It just doesn't cut it. And any bright ideas at all about how we overcome this lack of ceremony in an online world?
Yeah, I think that's a real issue. And of course, we feel it particularly, Julian, because you and I at this stage will be sitting on a platform with our ceremonial robes on, giving out degrees, and we're not doing that. And that's heartbreaking for everybody was graduating from London Business School this year. I think that we have to build as much ritual as we can, and I can see lots of examples of people, putting in coffee mornings, trying to recreate in a virtual environment some of the things that are. And we've done that in my own group. We have virtual meetings every morning. We have coffee breaks every afternoon. We have Friday drinks and so on and so forth. I'm not saying that that's the answer, because these are exhausting, and what's missing is the fun. I think you were right, Julian. You shouldn't feel bad about that. What we're missing right now is fun, and anything that brings fun back into our lives is going to be really important, and we're all hoping for that moment. But Jenny, I don't know what your views are about ceremony and these great big moments of joyful.
No, we're similarly struggling, and I personally am struggling. I'm a person who likes to celebrate every Saint's Day and changing season and everything. Let's have a party and food and stuff. One thing that we did quite recently for a slightly different purpose was to have some people bring a physical object with them to a meeting that meant something to them or epitomized something. So that use of artifacts in a different way, it changed the conversation. It made it somehow, intimate in a different way. We've also had people playing with their, how you can change your background and put photographs that mean something to you. So we've asked some people sometimes to do that as well. It's no substitute for fun and champagne and celebration and ceremony, but it's you can still change the tone a bit.
Well, for me, it's been totally heartbreaking.
Oh, go on then. You're going to bring us a bit of a digital artifact.
Oh, yeah, because my book, The New Long Life, was launched last week with no champagne. And Julian, I'm a girl who likes champagne. I like bubbles. So we just did a virtual thing at the Hay Festival. Ooh. Anyway, I agree. I can't wait to get back to normal.
Yeah. Well, this is it. And obviously, stadiums around the world which were designed to seat 80,000 people. I mean, you can imagine a world where you actually create stadiums which are the same physical size but only have 20,000 people or 10,000 people. I mean, we're hoping that it doesn't come to that, but you can actually redesign everything with a little bit of social distancing, and you can replicate ceremonial things. Any last point either of you like to make? If you've been
let me make a last point, Julian. Fantastically interesting chat, and I'm so glad we enabled it, because we've had loads of those. I shall make a commitment to take a look at those chats and to pull out any of the interesting ideas that you've got, and if you send me a note, I'll include that in the note I'm going to send you. So I'll take a look at that. Well, when I say somebody will take a look at that in the next couple of hours and come back to you, because there's some wonderful stuff there. So thank you so much. It's been a great research program as much as a webinar.
Perfect. Jenny, any last thoughts from your side in terms of what?
No, I don't think anything beyond that. Just a great big thank you. I haven't been able to keep up with all of the chat and the Q&A, but it's been really rich, loads of ideas there. So thank you very much.
Perfect. Good. Look, we are going to close there. Thank you to Jenny and Linda for a terrific set of ideas. There's some really valuable practical stuff there. Now we're going to finish. Thank you once again for attending and hopefully enjoying this webinar.